Hello, and welcome back to Anth It Up, a podcast about anthropological theory and interesting ways it can be applied. My name is Sarah Beth Becker, and my pronouns are she, her. It is now week 9 or so of the new semester, and I've finally crawled out from under my pile of work and a second degree ankle sprain to finish this episode. I'd like to say that I'll be more frequent in the future, but honestly, it just depends on how much work I have. Either way, let's get this started. I know I said last episode I was thinking of doing something with economics this time, but I decided that I'd rather talk about something I wrote an essay about last semester and has come up several times already this one: agency. This episode will be a non exhaustive stroll through the different ways agency has been handled in anthropology. I'll explain how and why different scholars at different times approach the concept in, you'll never guess, different ways. I'll also give you my opinion on agency at the end and explore why understanding agency can be helpful in understanding the world around us. But first, a tangent. Have you ever heard the song Cognitive Dissonance Blues by the Narcissist Cookbook? I say song, but it's one of their works that's a bit closer to spoken poetry rather than music. I'm going to describe it here, so if you haven't heard it, you should still get the full effect, but I really recommend pausing this and going to listen if you have the time. Preferably on YouTube. I think the music video adds a lot to the song. The song opens with the singer in a grocery store narrating their shopping. They look, almost absent-mindedly, at the back of a box of vegetable stock cubes when they realize that the cubes contain palm oil. If you didn't know, palm oil is both an incredibly common additive and one that is produced through incredible economic, environmental, and human destruction, primarily in Malaysia and Indonesia. It's the kind of thing that once you know about it, you feel vaguely guilty about buying every time you notice it. And that's precisely what happens to the singer. The song moves through the abject human misery and destruction that undergirds every aspect of consumption in modern Western society, and the singer's own, quote, tacit nod of approval every time they buy their Oreos and Coke. The song then moves into a spiral through eco-fascist rhetoric. You've probably heard it before. Humans are a blight upon the earth, a disease for which the only cure is death. And that narrative is seductive. It confirms the guilty feeling you get when you do things like purchase stock cubes after researching palm oil. But the song rejects this viewpoint, pointing out that the average person has absolutely zero control over the ways that things are produced and how they're sold. Most people are just trying to get by in the world around them. It's absurd to ask someone living paycheck to paycheck to account for their role in the carbon pollution of ExxonMobil. They simply have no input on it. And this is where the song concludes, with the singer reflecting on the absurdity of worrying about purchasing stock cubes with palm oil when their decision, quite literally, does not matter. Whether or not they individually in this moment choose to buy the cubes, palm oil farming will continue. Carbon pollution will continue. Nestle will keep trying to make water not a human right. Cognitive dissonance. And yet, the singer puts the cubes back. They walk away as the guitar gives one final riff and the song ends. The moment sticks with me. Here they are, after just singing an entire song about how this decision that they're making does not matter, how practically there is no difference between purchasing the cubes and leaving them in the store. But they still make the choice to leave it. I'm going to return to this moment at the end of the episode. It's the thing that got me thinking about this topic in the first place. This episode is about agency, and you might be able to guess why I talked about this song here, but we'll get there soon enough. First things first. What even is agency? I'd like to start with that definition, but that's difficult for reasons that'll be clear as we move through this topic, so instead I'll start with why anthropologists have opinions on what agency is in the first place, and that requires us to talk about structure. You see, agency and structure are constant concerns in anthropology, and they often appear together. Undercovering the structures that undergird people's lives is one of the key focuses of the discipline, after all. However, there's a tension there. When anthropologists talk about structure, be it with structural functionalism or post-structuralism, they're talking about large-scale societal structures in which the individual does not matter very much. And if we take agency to be the property of an individual, then agency certainly doesn't seem to matter here. But that's the problem. Who's to say that it is? What even is agency, really? What's structure, for that matter? Clearly, we need a better starting point to figure this out, especially because it's precisely this debate between the importance of structure, agency, and their changing meanings that's fueled a lot of anthropological debate in the last 50 years. And if you know anything about anthropology these days, you won't be surprised to hear that the power relations between anthropologists and their subjects has been a major part of it. As is often the case, Clifford Geertz provides a convenient starting point for understanding the development of anthropological debates. Geertz was an incredibly influential anthropologist whose work is still taught to this day. Full disclosure, I really like reading Geertz. I think his works are interesting and insightful. Unfortunately for him, his prominence also means that anyone critiquing trends in the discipline around 50 or so years ago is likely to use him as their example. Like me, right now. In one very, very influential book chapter, Religion as a Cultural System, he defined religions as a system of symbols, which are involved with, quote, establishing powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men, and, quote, formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. If we take religion as an example of structure, we can see that Geertz sees structure as complete systems with definite effects on people, a sort of a priori existence. In other words, they exist before people's perceptions and understandings of them. I was raised as a Catholic, so I'll use it as an example. You could say that Catholicism is a structure which creates certain behaviors and moods in its participants, like causing them to be charitable. It is definite in the sense that it is consistent. All participants become charitable and not something random each time. Remember, this is just an example of what Geertz is talking about. Catholics are not themselves creating Catholicism by being charitable in this scheme. They are charitable because the structure of Catholicism moves them to be. Now, depending on your relationship to Catholics or Catholicism, you may agree more or less with that example. And to be clear, Geertz didn't give this one specifically, it's something I made up, but it shows the problems that people did have with his approach. It's overly deterministic. There's no rooms for the different ways that people might respond to a given structure or even change it over time. It also avoids the problem of how religions came to be in the first place and why they continue to exist, which is a problem for another day. For this episode, it's enough for us to take as a starting point the idea of structures as things that exist before humans interact with them that have definite effects on people. Agency really isn't addressed at all. People do what the structure motivates them to do. We're using this as a starting point precisely because pretty much everyone writing on structure and agency from this point on in anthropology is responding to Geertz in some way, some more explicitly than others. Finally, before we move on to another take on agency, I want to lay out what I think are the three main ways the term is used. They are, in no particular order, the ability to take actions that meaningfully change the world around you, the ability to take autonomous action, or the ability to choose between responses to a given situation. These meanings aren't mutually exclusive. They can and do occur alongside each other. The interesting bit happens when one or more is excluded or argued against. And this is what we're going to be looking at to try and figure out the most useful understanding of agency for us today. So, let's take a look at the post-structuralist tradition. Personally, I think it's the most misleadingly named philosophical/anthropological tradition because it's still very much about structure, it just approaches it in a different way. Namely, post-structuralist scholars write against the idea of structures as things that have definite bounds and exist before human understandings of them. Perhaps the most famous post-structuralist was Michel Foucault, a French scholar whose theories about power and discipline revolutionized several disciplines, including anthropology. He argued that power is a, quote, productive network which runs through the whole social body, that functions in both repressive and productive ways, which, quote, make possible the meticulous control of the operations of the body. In other words, unlike Geertz, who sees structures as being these clearly defined things that you can point to and talk about as if they were almost physical things, Foucault sees structures as founded on power that is diffuse, in other words, spread through the, quote, whole social body. The structure is there, but it doesn't work as a concrete thing. Instead, its shape is found in the cumulative and repetitive effects it has on many people through discipline. It's this diffusion of power and its control over the bodies of people that characterizes agency in the Foucauldian model, which is to say that there is none. Foucault is not interested in the actions of individuals, meaningful or not, only in how power, knowledge, and truth serve to create types of people according to the needs of societal structures like capitalism. The people being disciplined have no say in the matter. So how does this model compare to Geertz on the topic of agency? Well, Gertz actually has more agency in his model of structure than Foucault because of his discussion of moods and motivations. While he believes that structures induce specific moods and motivations in people, it's still up to the people themselves to act on them. In this sense, he's not really concerned with agency in the sense that people can make choices that change the world around them, or their ability to make choices all on their own, but Gertz does seem to indicate that people can choose how they respond to a structure. Foucault, on the other hand, doesn't care about agency at all. But this doesn't mean that all post-structural approaches that prioritize power say that agency doesn't exist. Pierre Bourdieu was another French scholar, there's a lot of them in anthropological theory, who was writing in the newly emerging post-structuralist tradition, and he introduced the concept of habitus, a, quote, subjective but not individual system of internalized structures, schemes of perception, conception, and action common to all members of the same group or class. This concept explicitly centers the way that people strategize in their relationships with each other, playing with variables such as time to create meaning and relationships within the bounds of their shared habitus. They do not have agency in the first two senses, but they do have agency in the third sense, being able to choose how they respond to a situation. There are a lot of similarities here to how Gertz understood agency, even if their understanding of structures is totally different. To be fair, I think Foucault's approach also allows for the third sense of agency, as discipline doesn't produce only a single type of person. People can theoretically pick from one or more alternative paths within limits, but his tradition does de-emphasize the notion of the self to the point where talking about agency, at least at the level of the individual, is to completely miss the point. And therein lies one of the main problems with talking about agency and whether it's real. We have to decide whether individuals truly exist. That probably sounds silly. Of course, individuals exist. I'm an individual. No one is denying that individual people physically exist. It would be a little silly to. But that's not what's being debated here. The problem is whether we can consider people to be meaningfully unique when we're talking about societies as a whole. Structural approaches sort of necessarily have to say that no, people are not unique. There are kinds of people, sometimes many different kinds, depending on what factors you're looking at in that moment, but for all their individual life experiences, people can be reliably grouped by their similarities. The very idea of structures, be they in the original sense like Gertz or the post-structural sense of Foucault and Bourdieu, eliminate the idea of agency as autonomy. It is possible to make a truly autonomous decision when a person is part of a system. Here's an example. I chose to go to college. I technically had an option here. I could have gone to trade school, military, or even just entered the workforce right away. But one look at my background. I had parents with college degrees. I had a middle-class upbringing. I went to a private school. I got good grades. I'm also just white. And it's pretty clear that college was an inevitability for me. I was under immense social pressure to go to college. But because my values and goals aligned with that pressure, I didn't really experience it as such, and going to college felt like my own choice. However, my decision was not and never could be autonomous. Equally important, it was not unique. And honestly, this is as good of a time as any to reconsider our definitions of agency. I think that we can toss out the idea of autonomy being the ability to make autonomous decisions. Even if there isn't someone literally standing over your shoulder pushing you to make certain choices, your background, the place you live, the things happening around you are all going to influence your decision in many ways. So where does that leave our other two definitions of agency? Well, some post-structural approaches, like Bourdieu's, definitely allow for agency in the sense of choosing how to respond to situations. However, his approach doesn't really consider if people have agency in the sense of making meaningful changes in the world around them. By that, I mean large, systematic, some might say structural changes, rather than interpersonal ones. Foucault definitely doesn't allow for such agency. Still, the answer is unclear. Maybe looking at other theories could help. Because questions of structure and agency are not restricted to post-structuralist discourse. Moral anthropology, for example, also tackles it. Moral anthropology is a theoretical trend dedicated to understanding the ways in which people try to live good lives. If you want a more detailed look at it, then listen to the pilot episode of this podcast. In any case, Cheryl Mattingly claims that moral anthropology partially developed from people questioning, quote, the idea of the moral as confined to unreflective norm following, while trying to avoid, quote, the notion of the autonomous individual who can choose her own moral destiny. a position at odds with the very idea of structure in anthropology. To translate, moral anthropology rejects the idea that people have no ability to make choices about their lives whatsoever, or that such choices are irrelevant, which would be the post-structural approach. But it still avoids the idea that people can choose their destinies completely autonomously. You might think that this sounds very similar to Bourdieu's approach, and while I think that there are differences, they're kind of too technical to get into here. Living a moral or good life, the focus of moral anthropology, requires deliberate action, which implies agency in at least one of three senses. Nor is moral anthropology the only theoretical development to center agency. Non-human and beyond the human approaches like actor network theory, I'm going to call it ANT, and multi-species ontology raise questions of what it means to be an actor. In ANT, Anna-Marie Moll states that, quote, an actor acts. It, he, she does something, makes a difference, such that if it were eliminated, it would, quote, take others a lot of work to replace those actions. An actor in ANT, then, is anything that does something. In his multi-species ethnography, How Forests Think, Eduardo Cohn argues that the ant definition glosses over too many distinctions between living and non-living actors, pointing out that living actors' agency comes from their selves, the, quote, product of a specific relational dynamic that involves absence, future, and growth, as well as the ability for confusion. Coe's agency for living beings is founded on communication and all the possibilities of action that entails. These three models of agency, despite their difference, share a dedication to resolving the problem of agency when structure seems to be the only real thing in anthropology. Moral anthropology has several models that consider agency. Ordinary ethics, for example, looks at how, quote, the small quotidian acts stand up to the horrific, the violence and limitations put on ordinary life by the structures of the world around people. Here's your vocab word of the day, quotidian. It just means ordinary or everyday. Anthropologists love their vocab words. This is not an anthropology of grand acts of resistance, but one that attends to the ways that people, consciously or not, make choices to live good lives, restricting the scope of agency to the everyday. The stuff that seems inconsequential compared to the scale of structure is moral anthropology's way of avoiding the issue of autonomy. It doesn't matter if an action makes a meaningful difference to the larger world around a person, and it doesn't matter if that choice was made totally freely. It's agency in the third sense. On the other hand, ANT takes aim at structure and finds agency located within those structures. Its focus on the importance of actors to systems highlights how the types of autonomy given to actors has significant consequences for systems. It's agency in both the first and third sense. Finally, the ontological approach, in its emphasis on communication and response to signs, examines agency in the third sense. However, it's different from moral anthropology because it doesn't focus on the everyday or even on morality, but on how the idea of radically different worlds can allow for different responses and therefore agency. Through all of this, it should be clear that the concept of agency is alive and well in anthropology, despite the substantial impact that Foucauldian structure had on the discipline. Even anthropologists working within an explicitly Foucauldian tradition refer to agency, though it's as the product of groups of people situated in specific social contexts. This raises an important point about all the agencies discussed up to this point. None of them are necessarily the property of individuals. The agency of moral anthropology, in the ordinary ethics sense, and the ontological approach exist primarily as the property of groups, which is exercised by individuals within said groups. Ant is possibly an exception here, as it is possible to talk about individuals like Pasteur having a unique importance in systems, like the one surrounding the discovery of anthrax. But this apparent autonomy is balanced by how Ant explicitly foregrounds the dependence of such individuals on, quote, an entire army of people and things. Either way, framing agency as the property of groups and their positions within structures allows for interesting considerations of what kinds and how much agency in the third sense that people have, or that they're allowed. Let's return to cognitive dissonance blues. I said that the reason the song stuck with me as much as it did, and the reason that I was talking about it here, was that moment at the end. The moment where the singer put the stock cubes back. To me, that's what agency is. or at least the way that agency should be understood when trying to understand people, their actions, and lives. The choice to put the stock cube back was not anonymous. It was made in consideration of numerous structural factors, including dietary and monetary concerns, socially uncertain values, about environmentalism and health rights, and even the physical design of the store and packaging set up to entice you to buy as much as possible. The choice also didn't have any meaningful impact on the immediate world around them. No grand revolutions, no sweeping societal changes, not even a slight dent in the manufacturer's profits. A single box of stock cubes, after all, is insignificant in the sheer face of scalar capitalism, the endless pursuit of infinite growth. But it wasn't meaningless. At least I don't think so. Sure, it might not have been made of totally their own volition, and it might not have changed much about the world around them, but there was still meaning there. Maybe it was a sense that they'd finally had enough with participating passively in the system. Maybe it was frustration, a choice to avoid dealing with such a dissonance inducing issue any further. Whatever it was, it had a meaning for them. And now that they've put it into a song, it has a meaning for us too. Most people's choices might not directly impact the world around them in a way that falls outside of what the system's boundaries deem possible, but they do have meaning. And understanding those meanings and how they drive people's actions and their influence on others around them is, I think, what agency is all about. It's this approach that I consider having the most potential in anthropology, particularly in the context of the anthropology of the good. It allows the anthropologist to attend to the ways in which people make what they consider to be meaningful choices without treating them as perfectly autonomous individuals. It allows for considerations of how many aspects of a person's life are outside of their control, while also highlighting questions of who might otherwise get that control and why. This is especially important in my own work, as access to gender affirming care is explicitly framed around agency and morality by trans people, politicians, and physicians alike. Trans people are stripped of agency that cis people are given by default in the medical system because they are structurally determined to be uniquely incompetent when it comes to understanding themselves and their place in society. I am a cis woman on a hormone replacement therapy that is functionally indistinguishable to that of a trans woman. But because I'm cisgender, all it took was a round of blood work, and the doctor quickly signed off on my prescriptions, even getting my diagnosis wrong in the process. In contrast, a trans woman might have to go to months of therapy just to have a shot at that blood work. The stripping of agency in medical contexts causes trans people to develop alternate methods of transitioning, like DIY, by building off existing networks for under-the-table hormones for insecure cis people, for example. DIY is alternatingly framed as an act of resistance, an act of equity, and as an act of survival, but there is always a sense of trans people taking matters into their own hands. Even this form of agency, however, is affected by structural constraints around societal acceptance and local availabilities of supplies, making considerations of the interplay between agency and structure important for my research. Perhaps the word agency is the problem, and its connotative baggage of autonomy. I've definitely felt frustration when using it for that very reason. However, I don't think that ditching it entirely is a good solution. Like the term culture, agency is a term with strong recognition outside of the discipline, at least in America, and it's useful for communicating findings to the public. It falls to anthropologists, then, to rehabilitate the term, or, at the very least, make their usage of it as clear as possible to avoid confusion. If you didn't know, the term culture is contentious in anthropology these days, which is extremely funny if you don't know anything about that debate, but makes perfect sense if you do. Maybe I'll get into it someday. Either way, for non-anthropologists, understanding agency as permittable actions instead of structural boundaries, actions that have meaning to their actors but don't necessarily matter to others, can be helpful in understanding why things are the way they are and how things can change. I think most people alive today agree that the world as it currently is needs to change. Now, some of those people want to change it for the worse, but I digress. The point is that this sort of change is only possible when we stop and take a critical look at the world around us and understand it as it is, not as our ideologies, like American individualism, make it seem. That's what I hope you take away from this episode, at least. That's also my materialist disclaimer. Materialists, please don't get mad at me. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I took you through a brief tour of different anthropological understandings of agency before revealing the one that I personally use, at least right now. My opinion will probably change a bit as I learn and work more, but I feel pretty confident in this sets at least a starting point. I've got no clue what the next episode will be about. It's just a matter of what I find time to research, and I don't have a whole lot of time right now. As always, there's a link to my sources in the description, and you can find me on Twitter at s+b² if you want to follow me or chat. I'll be there until the site becomes unusable, which sort of seems like it'll happen sooner rather than later. Thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day, and remember to anth it up.